March has been a busy month on the housing front. Massachusetts lawmakers are starting to kick the tires on two ballot measures that might find their way to voters in November, pulling from completely different playbooks to tackle our housing crisis. That would be rent control and also allowing single-family construction on smaller lots. The state Senate, at least, is working on a sprawling housing bill. Also, it's budget season, which means a lot of attention on how the cost of living crisis is pushing young people out of the state. And then there's the federal side of things. A bipartisan coalition headed up by Massachusetts Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren and South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott has sent the so-called Road to Housing Act out of the U.S. Senate and over to a seemingly skeptical House of Representatives. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today I'm chatting with Matt Noyes, Director of State and Federal Advocacy for the Citizens Housing and Planning Association, or CHAPA. A lot of state eyes have been focused on our own legislature, but Matt's been keeping an eye on the national picture too, and the Road to Housing Act will certainly have implications here in the Bay State. And for the housing policy nerds, CommonWealth has been following a lot of these developments, so we'll have reading links in the show notes if you want to learn more. So, Matt, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to this.
So let's start kind of on the very highest level that we possibly can here, which is this is a massive omnibus bill. It has almost every proposal that the folks in the housing universe could kind of throw at the wall here to kind of address the housing crisis. So taking yourself back a little bit, before we saw the final version of this, we've seen kind of a lot of these proposals roll out before through both the federal level and the state level. So when you heard, okay, there's a huge bill and it is in fact probably coming out of the Senate, what were you immediately going to be looking for?
I was really looking for an attempt to make this bipartisan, to really recognize that this is not a red or a blue issue. It's not a north or a south issue. The entire country is really challenged with housing, not having enough homes. And so I was really interested to see what the approach was that the Senate was going to take on this and to bring everyone in. Things are so divided down in DC right now that I was really excited about the idea that this was a bill, a proposal, a set of proposals really that had that bipartisan support, and recognizing that there are significant barriers to housing. So what the Senate did and what the House really followed the lead. I shouldn't say the House followed the lead. The House is an independent branch and they did their own thing on this. But it was a similar recognition that there are significant barriers, structural barriers that are in place that are beyond financial. And they were really looking to remove those structural barriers so the homes could be built that we need.
So this Road to Housing Act here, which is something that Senator Elizabeth Warren, of course, has been pushing for some time, but also alongside Warren has been one of the names that's been often kind of paired up with her at this point on these housing fronts, which is the Republican Senator Tim Scott. Mm-hmm. If they're, regular Commonwealth readers here, they might mostly be familiar with him as coming up in conversations around opportunity zones, mm-hmm. Which has been kind of a not uncontroversial proposal from the Trump administration over time, aimed at encouraging investment in sort of a selection of underdeveloped, underinvested in areas. That's seen some changes over the years. But again, I'm doing what I always do, which is lay out a bit of groundwork first. So when you're talking about kind of that bipartisanship, that long partnership at this point that Warren and Scott have had on a few of these specific housing proposals, has that seemed like it was necessarily leading to sharp, targeted housing reforms, or something that might seem more palatable across parties? I guess my question is essentially, is there such a thing as actual bipartisan housing policy?
What they did, what Senator Scott and Senator Warren did in crafting the original Road to Housing bill, was basically go to every committee member and say, what do you want to see in this bill? And every single committee member has a proposal that they can point to and say, this is mine. This is something that I can go back to my constituents and say, look what we have gotten into this bill. And so by giving everyone a sense of ownership in that committee, this is not a Democratic bill. It's not a Republican bill. This is truly a bill of the committee and every member of that committee. And it was a brilliant move by them to get a unanimous vote out of committee. That is not something that happens often these days. And to do that, I really give a lot of credit to both Senator Scott and Senator Warren for getting that done.
And, this is where I'd throw in that as the senator has talked about it over the past week or so, she's used a number of different metaphors and analogies for discussing it. And the one that most sung to me was referring to it as a meatball, really just packing a bunch of different stuff in and baking it. On the kind of policy menu front, breaking apart that meatball a little bit here, when you, looking at it from a Massachusetts lens, we're trying to figure out which might be interesting or useful policies and which might be targeted at areas that don't have much commonality with Massachusetts. Were there any major kind of proposals where you said, oh, I really hope that they get this in?
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces in here that we're excited about from Massachusetts, for sure. One of the things that has come up and is controversial because of some unintended consequences with it, we hear a lot from the Cape and the islands about concern around institutional investors purchasing single-family homes, and the impact that has on skewing the market down there. The Cape and islands housing markets are incredibly challenging. We work very closely with Senator Sear, with the House members from the Cape, and they are really feeling the squeeze down there. So the fact that they're included in here, this ban on institutional investors purchasing single-family homes, I think there's a lot of support for that down in our seasonal communities. One of the challenging pieces in there is there's also the way the language is written right now, it also prevents institutional investment in kind of the build to rent housing, which we really need because that's where a lot of the money is going to come from investors. And we need more rental properties as well in the state. And there's language in there that would require the sale of those properties within 7 years, which it could potentially have a real chilling effect on in institutional investment in rental properties. So that's something that we're hoping will get worked out, and we're having a lot of conversations. CHAPA and groups across the country are having conversations with folks in DC, and we're still hopeful that we can come to a resolution on that. So that was one piece we were very excited about.
So I'm so glad that you brought that up first, because that's basically taken a lot of kind of the headlines, the attention on this. Funnily enough, at CommonWealth, this is something that we've kind of been poking around the edges on for a while, because we've been hearing kind of a lot of fear and confusion from communities about the idea that private equity is maybe like the major player in these different housing crises. And the story's a little bit more complicated than that. So I think that part of what I've been struggling with is the language of the bill being a little bit vague, but being very focused on what they're calling kind of these institutional investors. So that's investors who own 350 homes, basically, this kind of very large scale of investment buying up single family homes. But I think it's been also a little hard for people to get their head around just how common that is in some parts of Massachusetts or some parts of the country, but not others. So I wonder, could you talk a little bit about sort of the philosophical and emotional side of that you've been hearing? Because I think that really has sort of colored the narrative and made it a little bit messy at getting under the hood about, how much of this is driving the crisis in the homeownership market.
It would be a wonderful thing if we could point to one single factor that is resulting in the housing challenges that we have right now. There is not one single factor. There's a whole meatball of factors, I guess, as Senator Warren would say, that are going into this, and they all play a role, and we need to address all of them. What we hear a lot from particularly the Cape and the islands, because it is such a unique market with this, the summer rentals really skew everything down there. And so we hear a lot about institutional investors coming in, purchasing properties, renting them out for very high amounts over the summer months. And it really hurts a lot of the Cape economy and the Cape market down there. We're hearing so many folks are coming over the bridges on a daily basis in order to get to jobs because they just cannot find homes on Cape Cod. And so I think that's something that we really need to address for those communities. To a lesser degree, we hear about it in the southern Berkshire County and some different areas, but the Cape is really the epicenter of that here in Massachusetts. So it is something that we need to look at. I don't have very specific information on what the number of homes are and what the percentages are, but it is absolutely a contributing factor. There's a whole range of challenges that we have around the housing market, and it will make an improvement to address this. Is it going to be the single panacea that's going to result in everything coming together? No, but it will move us in that direction, and that's a positive thing for sure.
Yeah, I was so interested in it around the kind of seasonal communities universe, essentially, because for so many years, they've spoken quite frankly about what it's like to lose that year-round housing to either folks who came in during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic, when that suddenly became very desirable and bought up housing, and then did one of two things. Either they had enough money that they didn't want the rental income, so entire houses were taken off the market. And then there were ones who bought them specifically to rent. So I think my last question on this point is, how is CHAPA thinking right now, and how are you thinking right now about kind of the health of a rental market and a homeownership market? Because one of the critiques here has been, well, the houses aren't mostly vanishing, but they're becoming rental. And so if you're not building more homes, then you're necessarily going to see sort of like a skew from a traditional homeownership starter home model over into, I guess you can rent a single family home, but there are also people who want to rent single family homes. So how have you been thinking about those two dynamics?
We need to build housing of all types. We need to build home ownership opportunities. We need to build rental opportunities. We need to build, single family home ownership opportunities, single family rental opportunities, townhomes, condominiums. We need everything across the map. And it is an advantage when we have a reliable starter home market where folks can move into for their first home, not only because it gives them that security and that financial, a new financial situation, new financial stability, but it also removes that person from a rental market so somebody else can move into that rental unit, and it benefits everyone in the process. So we need all of the homes. We need all throughout the income levels, throughout the housing types. We need every type of home in Massachusetts.
Okay, let's move on to some of the other priority areas. What else that you saw in the road to housing did you go, oh, thank God, that's a brick in this road?
Yeah, lifting the cap on the rental assistance demonstration program is very, very helpful. We at CHAPA and the governor have been talking about this number of 222,000 new homes that we need in Massachusetts over the next 10 years. Those are net homes. So if we lose some of the homes that we have, particularly public housing that has, maintenance has fallen behind and it's not working, or if we lose those, then we got to build two homes just to keep our progress moving in the right direction. So lifting the cap on that and allowing for those private partnerships is so important, so we can maintain affordable homes that we have, we can preserve the affordable homes, and included in there is protection for tenants. What is going to happen to the folks living in those homes during the development process. Really encouraged about that.
So walk me through a little bit on how that is sort of structurally different than what we have now. I think for a lot of these different provisions, people go, okay, well, what are we looking at the moment? And then how much housing does that reasonably open up? What kind of structural changes does that make?
What we're seeing in public housing is this: we have an aging public housing stock that needs more and more investment to maintain itself, and things are getting more and more expensive. We're fortunate in Massachusetts, we have state public housing stock, which is wonderful. A lot of states don't have that. But we are challenged fiscally to invest enough to keep up with the existing maintenance needs and the capital needs of these properties. So by having these private-public partnerships in place, we can maintain the units, we can improve the units, and add additional units to them. And so you have these mixed income developments that result in more homes than we had to start with, owned by private investors, but maintaining the affordability of those public housing units moving forward. Clarendon Hill project in Somerville is a prime example of that and a real success story. So we need more of those type of projects, and lifting this cap will allow for more of those to go forward.
All right. Okay. Next on your list. Go for it.
Another piece is lifting the public welfare investment cap from 15 to 20%. This is something that when you talk about the low-income housing tax credit community, they are really looking at this as a real advantage. There's a lot of financial institutions that are running up against that 15% cap. So these are banks to invest in the communities. And by bringing it up that additional 5%, that can free up more dollars that can be used to support low-income housing tax credit projects, and that's a real advantage. We saw, over the summer there was the Budget Reconciliation Act that Congress passed, and the president signed. It had a lot of very challenging things in it in a lot of ways, but one of the things in there that we looked at as being a positive was a lot of improvements to the low-income housing tax credit program, which has been a driver of the development of affordable housing across the country and here in Massachusetts. And so to have that paired with the PWI cap increase, that's really going to help unlock a lot more housing production.
How have you been thinking about the push-pull here on the federal level, which is, of course, you noted the massive kind of tax bill that passed, I think it was on July 4th last year, that the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act passed. And so that had a lot of provisions in it that had housing advocates and fair housing advocates and people who are focused on affordable housing really kind of grabbing their heads and going, oh no, there are some kind of very troubling signs in the housing universe coming down the pike on this. And so now we have this proposal out of the Senate. We'll see what happens to it in the House. But on that tension here, is the federal government speaking with one voice in a consistent way that makes it easy to plan for, or does it feel like these kinds of policies are often in conflict?
Well, I mean, what was included in OB3 was certainly a positive for the housing world. I think everybody knew that there was going to be some transitions in the market as demand and pricing of LIHTC credits would be impacted by higher availability of them. But we're working through that right now. It is a positive sign that we have. There was other challenging things in that bill that we were talking about. So when we were talking about building homes for low-income households of low income, those are the same households that are also being affected by really draconian cuts to the Medicaid program. And so we're seeing that impacted at the same people who we're hoping to serve through housing are being impacted on the healthcare side as well. And we're seeing that impact in the state budget as we look for state investments as well. So it's not a clean story with that. We had a lot of mixed feelings when we saw OB3 signed into law, for sure.
And then one other theme, if I can, kind of pull at some themes out of this massive bill here, that seemed to have a parallel here in Massachusetts, was that idea of kind of making the review process easier, laying out things like one policy, if I could shout back all the way to my, baby reporter days in Dorchester, when Boston was playing around with this program that involved pre-reviewing the style of housing, essentially. So saying if you agree that this is the type of housing that could be built, it might look like this. That makes the review process much cleaner down the line because you've already kind of got agreement and sign on some of these styles. There's a provision like that in this larger bill here. There are some parallels around environmental review processes that we've been seeing the governor talk about. So where are some parallels that you've seen between both kind of the state side action and priorities and then that federal sweep?
Yeah, when at the beginning of this legislative session, we convened a lot of our CHAPA members to talk about what are the policy levers that would unlock housing. And they talked, certainly financing and dollars are going to be helpful, but one of the things that they talked about was regulatory challenges that they had. A lot of developers are challenged when they are starting a project, when they're looking to move the project through the approval process. They've got to pass an environmental review at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level, all at the same time. And there's so much duplication between those and a delay in every process. And sometimes you can't go into the next one until you have the first one done. And so to talking about streamlining NEPA reviews in the Road to Housing Act, that's going to move things forward for sure. The governor's talked about improving the regulatory review process at the state level, which is wonderful.
And one of the other areas that seem to have some parallels as well were, spots that are leaning into modular housing production, which has been something that plenty of places in Massachusetts are sort of starting to think about, how best to use vacant plots, essentially. So have these sort of, because we started this conversation sort of talking about how folks from all over the country kind of in the Senate were throwing ideas in and out here. Were there any that you saw come through and you just went, I mean, if that works for you, I guess, but that's not really a major priority here in Massachusetts?
I think the items that you're highlighting in particular are items that we are looking at here in Massachusetts quite a bit. Modular housing is really this real opportunity. We build homes in the same way for decades, if not centuries at this point. And to look at the idea of building in a new way, a lot of off-site building, it could really hold potential for speeding up the process of construction. Time is money when it comes to development. So the sooner we can get homes online safely and high quality homes is certainly a good thing. We're seeing this in other countries. HUD just released a report about 2 weeks ago on modular housing and some of the policy opportunities that we have to speed that up. CHAPA is looking at that quite a bit and seeing what can we look at here in Massachusetts. What are the opportunities that we have in that way? Another opportunity is with vacant lands and vacant properties. The state, through the Affordable Homes Act, talked about surplus land. And about a year ago, the governor, in combination of the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities and Divisional Capital Asset Management, came up with the State Lands for Homes program that is basically moving state surplus property to be used for housing, and that's a real great opportunity that we have. The federal bill talks about vacant land. At the state, the piece of omnibus legislation talks about an evaluation of grayfields properties across the state and deciding which ones could be appropriate for homes in the state. So property is really something that we're looking at as really one of the things we need to have. We are a small state, and property is a real driving factor. And so how we use our land is really going to determine how many homes we can build.
One thing that was occurring to me as I was going through this legislation is that one thing that we hear a lot as there are efforts around things like the MBTA Communities Act, efforts to kind of make zoning friendlier to building more across the state of Massachusetts, is a lot of the time there's kind of a local resistance to kind of changing the way that a city or town feels, kind of fears about increasing density too quickly, infrastructure, that sort of thing. I wasn't really seeing anything like particularly making reference to that, obviously, in this bill, which involves a lot of kind of different moving parts that sort of taken as a whole would make it a little easier to sort of chip away at some of the tools, I think, that communities have for sort of pushing back on those. But I was curious on your kind of philosophical read on this, on to what extent does this address the way that people can kind of fling roadblocks into the way of housing for well-meaning and less well-meaning reasons?
Yeah, the federal legislation, doesn't go as far as what we are really looking at the state level. Zoning for a long time has been used to say no to housing. And with the passage of the MBTA Communities Act and the implementation, really the successful implementation of that act, we have, well over 93-95% of the communities subject to MBTA communities have passed compliance measures, and it's a real wonderful thing. We're looking at zoning as a way to say yes to housing. There is a recognition that we need more homes in Massachusetts. The housing market has been so challenging for everyone, and we can't do things in the same way. So one of the things that CHAPA has been working on, and the legislature has been working on with us, and we see a real encouraging bill in the Senate in particular, is looking at local zoning and ways that we can use local zoning to facilitate the construction of homes that we need. So we're really excited about that opportunity. So I think that's something that's going to happen more at the state level because it's so localized to a region. Federal zoning legislation would be really challenging in that way.
Okay, the last thing I think that I want to hit is kind of the expensive elephant in the room here, which is because of changes at the federal level, Massachusetts is, more anxious about the fiscal picture going forward. We are in a ballot season that might involve some changes to the fiscal health of the Commonwealth if some of these ballot measures pass. So how much of kind of implementing or changing or improving housing policy is going to be impacted by this more kind of frustrated federal approach to funding things, especially in places like Massachusetts here? Is that kind of a complete side question that these don't need sort of dedicated funding, or they will because people will need to figure out how to implement them, or we're going to need to pay staff and all of that?
The items in the Road to Housing Act, I don't foresee having a fiscal impact on Massachusetts, but certainly OB3 is having a real budget challenge for the state. I was very, very happy to see the governor's budget proposal at the end of January really held the line on funding for housing programs in the face of really significant cuts to federal reimbursement for Medicaid here in the state. I applaud the governor. I applaud this administration for recognizing the importance of housing and for holding up these really significant, important programs that we have that benefit low and moderate income households. The MRVP program, the Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program, she proposed an increase in funding for that will create about 340 new vouchers. She proposed an increase for the operating fund for public housing across the state, which is so important to move in that positive direction. So even in the face of real significant fiscal challenges, and the governor held the line on housing, and I applaud her for that. She has identified housing as her top priority of her administration, and she's been holding true to that.
Okay, last thing, very quick, is just looking ahead. We're going to see how the Road to Housing Act ends up playing out. It's been interesting to me to see kind of so much of its fate sort of hang on that investor, purchaser, renter provision, because the president has also talked about that as something that he's interested in. So as you're kind of watching this move forward, any sort of last thoughts on that, on kind of what it can do and what it can't do?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the possibility of Congress passing significant legislation. The window is closing, having to do with politics outside of the housing world. But I think Congress is really focused on this as an important issue, and across the aisle. We saw, the initial passage of both bodies of the different versions of these big housing bills. It was a total of 15 votes against the two bills between the House and the Senate. That's unheard of, to have that sort of virtual unanimity of Congress these days. So there's a real recognition there, and I think there's an opportunity. It'd be a shame if this doesn't happen. And if it doesn't happen, my view on this is that it will not happen because of reasons that have nothing to do with housing. Foreign affairs, politics, some of the other bills that the president has prioritized, and what might happen with debates. The longer we get into this year, politics will play more and more of a role as we get further into primary season. So I'm hopeful that the bill will move, and both the House and the Senate will come together, and come up with a great bill to really address housing challenges across the country.
All right, great. Well, Matt, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate it.
Thanks again to Matt Noyes for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is by Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.